November 23, 1943. Blackwater House, Scottish Highlands. Thomas Whitmore had been Churchill's personal security detail for 8 months. That's exactly why the 12 German commandos who parachuted onto the moor that night never expected to find him waiting. 11 bodies lay in the snow by dawn. One German officer knelt in Churchill's study, hands bound, bleeding from a head wound. Thomas had his Webley pressed to the man's temple when the Nazi whispered 6 words that changed everything. "Your brother is alive in Moscow." What happened in the next 60 seconds became the most classified file in British intelligence. Churchill himself sealed the records. And for 80 years, when MI6 veterans spoke about Blackwater House, they always came back to this moment. The night Thomas Whitmore chose family over country, the night one Nazi walked away with Britain's darkest secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Repeat that," Thomas whispered, his breath misting in the frigid Highland air that leaked through the manor's ancient windows. The German officer, barely 25, Thomas noted, with the kind of pale blue eyes that belonged in a university lecture hall, not a commando raid, lifted his bloodied head. "Hauptmann Heinrich Whitmore, your brother, captured at Dieppe. Stalin has been keeping him." Outside, snow continued to fall on the bodies of 11 Wehrmacht soldiers. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth where Churchill had been reading intelligence reports just hours before Thomas hustled him into the hidden passage behind the bookshelf. The Prime Minister was safe in the reinforced bunker 2 floors below, probably pacing and demanding updates through the intercom system. Thomas should press that button on the desk, should call for backup, should follow protocol. Instead, he found himself studying the Nazi's face for lies. Prove it. The German's bound hands shifted, and Thomas pressed the gun harder against his skull. Slowly. Jacket pocket. Left side. Thomas reached into the blood-stained Wehrmacht uniform and withdrew a small leather wallet. Inside, beneath forged British pounds and a fake Scottish identity card, his fingers found a photograph. Even in the lamplight, he recognized his brother's face, immediately older, thinner, but unmistakably Henry. Standing beside a Moscow building Thomas didn't recognize, wearing civilian clothes, very much alive. "The Soviet Union and Britain are allies," the German continued, his English accented but precise. "Yet your Mr. Churchill met with Stalin here, in secret, 3 weeks ago. Why do you think that is, Herr Whitmore?" Thomas's blood turned to ice. The meeting was classified at the highest levels. Even most of Churchill's inner circle didn't know about Stalin's visit to Blackwater House. Only 5 people in Britain knew the Soviet premier had been here, negotiating terms for something that went far beyond their public alliance. "You're fishing," Thomas said, but doubt crept into his voice. Stalin promised Churchill the Eastern Front would hold through winter. In exchange, Britain agreed to delay the Second Front until 1944. Thousands of Russians will die in that extra year, but it guarantees Churchill's position as Britain's wartime leader. The German's eyes never left Thomas's face. "Your brother discovered this arrangement. He was extracting Soviet intelligence when he was captured. Stalin keeps him alive as insurance." The clock struck midnight. In the distance, Thomas could hear vehicles approaching the backup he'd radioed for before the shooting started. Soon this room would be crawling with MI6 handlers, military intelligence, and cleanup crews. The German would disappear into the system, probably face a firing squad by dawn. "What do you want?" Thomas asked. "I want to live. You want your brother to live. Perhaps we can help each other. You're SS. You don't negotiate, you kill or die. I am Oberleutnant Klaus Richter. I am 24 years old. I studied literature at University of Vienna before the war." His voice carried a weariness that seemed decades older than his face. "I have seen enough death. I volunteer for this mission because I was told we would capture Churchill, end the war sooner, save lives. Instead, I watch 11 good men die in the snow." Thomas heard boots on the gravel outside, voices calling his name. In 30 seconds, this conversation would be over. "Stalin will release your brother if Britain honors the original timeline for invasion. 6 months earlier than Churchill promised." Richter leaned forward despite the gun. "I carry documentation of the secret agreement. If I escape, if I return to Berlin, the Wehrmacht will pressure Hitler to reveal Britain's betrayal to the world. Public opinion will demand Churchill act sooner. You're asking me to commit treason. I am asking you to save 2 lives and perhaps shorten a war. The front door of Blackwater House burst open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors. Thomas heard Captain Morrison's voice barking orders, coordinating a room-by-room sweep. Thomas had trained for this moment his entire career: capture or kill, protect the Prime Minister, preserve state secrets. The choice should be automatic. But Henry's face stared up at him from the photograph. His little brother, who'd joined the commandos against their mother's wishes, who'd written letters about wanting to make a difference, who'd been listed as killed in action 18 months ago. How do I know you'll keep your word? Because, Herr Whitmore, we are both soldiers who understand the cost of war. And because your brother's survival depends on my survival. Footsteps approached the study door. Thomas made his choice. In one fluid motion, he struck Richter across the temple with the Webley's grip, hard enough to render him unconscious, gently enough to avoid permanent damage. Then he moved to the window, unlatched it, and looked back at the Nazi's still form. When Morrison and his team broke down the study door 60 seconds later, they found Thomas Whitmore sitting beside an empty chair, claiming the 12th German had escaped through the window during the firefight. The lie came easier than breathing. The lie had been living inside Thomas Whitmore for 23 years, 4 months and 16 days. He counted because some mornings like this one, with October mist clinging to the heather-covered hills of his small Highland estate, the weight of that December night at Blackwater House pressed against his chest like a physical thing, the kind of pressure that made him reach for his morning tea with hands that still trembled, not from age, but from the memory of a choice that had saved one life and doomed another. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, watching his granddaughter Emma through the glass. She sat cross-legged in his garden, laptop balanced on her knees, surrounded by manila folders and photocopied documents that she'd spread across the weathered wooden table like tarot cards revealing an unwanted future. At 26, she had her grandmother's auburn hair and her grandfather's stubborn determination, a combination that had served her well in her doctoral studies at Edinburgh, but that now made Thomas's stomach clench with worry. Family legacy and historical narrative, personal stories from Britain's secret war. The title of her thesis, innocent enough to academic supervisors, dangerous enough to men like Thomas, who knew which stones should remain unturned. Through the window, he watched Emma hold up a faded photograph, one he recognized with a sinking heart. His brother Henry in uniform, taken just before Dieppe. She'd been collecting family documents for months, interviewing elderly neighbors, requesting military records through Freedom of Information requests that made Thomas wake in cold sweats. The kettle whistled. Thomas poured hot water over Earl Grey leaves, letting the familiar ritual steady his nerves. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's baking. Emma had made shortbread using their grandmother's recipe, filling the cottage with warmth and the kind of domestic peace Thomas had spent 2 decades building around himself like a fortress. This life groundskeeper for the Blackwood estate, grandfather to a brilliant young woman, keeper of prize-winning roses and a small flock of Highland sheep, represented everything Klaus Richter's survival had cost him. Every peaceful morning was purchased with Henry's life. Every quiet evening by the fire was built on the foundation of that December lie. Thomas carried his tea outside. The October air bit at his face, sharp with the promise of early winter. Emma looked up from her research, her green eyes bright with the excitement of discovery that made his chest tighten with love and terror. "Grandfather, look what I found in the Inverness archives." She held up a military transport manifest, her finger tracing a line of text, a record of unusual troop movements to an estate called Blackwater House in December 1943. The same week, Uncle Henry was reported killed in action. Thomas sat heavily in the chair across from her, his tea trembling slightly in its cup. "Emma, love, some history is better left undisturbed. But that's exactly what my thesis is about, how official histories silence personal narratives." Her voice carried the passion of academic pursuit. But Thomas heard something else underneath, the need to understand why her family carried such weight, why her grandfather sometimes stared into the distance with eyes full of ghosts. "There are gaps in the records, grandfather, classified sections, missing reports." It's like someone deliberately erased what happened, because someone had. Thomas remembered the debriefings, the NDAs, the careful editing of official timelines. Churchill's government had been thorough in burying Blackwater House and everything that happened there. They'd buried it so deep that even now, decades later, Emma's academic inquiries were probably triggering alerts in Whitehall filing cabinets. "Your uncle died serving his country," Thomas said carefully. "Some details remain classified to protect methods and personnel. But you served too, didn't you?" Emma leaned forward, her academic instincts sensing evasion. "Mrs. MacLeod in the village mentioned you'd been intelligence services before you came here. She said you'd been at some of the war's most sensitive operations." Mrs. MacLeod had always talked too much. Thomas made a mental note to have a conversation with his elderly neighbor about the value of discretion. A red postal van appeared on the narrow road leading to his cottage, its engine laboring up the hill. Thomas watched it approach with growing unease. He received little mail pension payments, agricultural journals, the occasional letter from Emma's parents in London. Unexpected deliveries made him think of other packages, other messages that arrived without warning to upend carefully constructed lives. "I'll see what the postman wants," he said, rising from his chair perhaps too quickly. Emma gathered her papers against the morning breeze. "Grandfather, I know you're trying to protect me from something, but whatever happened during the war, whatever Uncle Henry was involved in, it's part of our family story. I need to understand." Thomas paused at the garden gate, looking back at his granddaughter. In her determination, in the set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes, he saw Henry at 22, convinced he could make a difference in a world gone mad. The resemblance was so strong it stole his breath. "Some family stories have sharp edges, love," he said softly. "Be careful how tightly you hold them." The postal van pulled into his driveway, and Thomas walked toward whatever new reckoning had come to find him. The postman was young, too young to remember the war, too young to understand why an elderly man might hesitate before signing for a package that bore no return address. Thomas studied the brown paper wrapping, noting the careful penmanship that spelled out his name and address in fountain pen ink, the kind of old-fashioned precision that belonged to another era. "Came through special delivery," the postman said, consulting his clipboard. "From London, looks like. Someone paid extra for guaranteed delivery." Thomas signed with hands that had grown steady through decades of practice at concealing emotion. The package felt heavier than its size suggested, dense with the weight of memory made manifest. He waited until the postal van disappeared down the hill before returning to the garden, where Emma was photographing documents with her phone. "What is it?" she asked, looking up from her work. "Probably nothing important." The lie came automatically, polished smooth by years of use. "Just something from my pension office." But as Thomas settled into his chair and began unwrapping the package, he knew this was everything but nothing. The paper fell away to reveal a small wooden box, the kind used for storing jewelry or keepsakes. The wood was dark with age, carved with Germanic symbols that made his throat constrict. Inside, nested in faded black velvet, lay 3 items that transported him instantly back to that December night at Blackwater House. The first was a photograph, black and white, slightly blurred, showing the front facade of Blackwater House in winter. Snow covered the ground where 11 bodies had fallen. Thomas remembered taking this photograph the morning after, as part of the official documentation that was later classified and buried. But this wasn't his photograph. The angle was wrong, taken from farther back, from the perspective of someone hiding in the tree line. The second item made his blood turn to ice, a Nazi SS dagger, its silver blade engraved with runic symbols, its black handle worn smooth by use. He'd seen this dagger before, tucked into Klaus Richter's belt, as the young German officer lay unconscious in Churchill's study. The third item was a letter, written in the same careful script as the address label. Thomas unfolded it with trembling fingers, aware that Emma had stopped her research and was watching him with growing concern. "Herr Whitmore, I trust this package finds you well after all these years. I am writing from Salzburg, where I have lived quietly since 1945, under the name Klaus Riedel. I became a teacher of literature, as I had always intended before the war interrupted such peaceful ambitions." You will be wondering why I contact you now, after so many decades of silence. The answer is simple. I am dying. Cancer, the doctors tell me. Perhaps 3 months, perhaps 6. At my age, I am 77 now. Such news brings not panic, but clarity. I have spent 48 years keeping our agreement. I never spoke of what transpired at Blackwater House. I never revealed the documentation I carried about Churchill's arrangement with Stalin. I returned to Germany with your staged story of escape, but I told my superiors nothing of substance. The war ended 4 months later, and with it the relevance of political secrets that died with the Reich. But secrets have a way of surviving their keepers, Herr Whitmore. My granddaughter, yes, we both became grandfathers, it seems, has been organizing my papers as my illness progresses. She found documents I thought I had destroyed, maps of Blackwater House, photographs taken by my reconnaissance team before the raid, notes about British-Soviet negotiations. She believes these materials have historical value. She wishes to donate them to a museum in Vienna, to contribute to what she calls a more complete understanding of wartime intelligence operations. She is a historian, much like your own granddaughter, I suspect. Young people with noble intentions and dangerous curiosity. I have delayed her as long as possible, but I fear that after my death, she will proceed with her plans. The Austrians are less careful with wartime secrets than the British. Once these documents become public, investigations will follow. Your name appears in my notes, Herr Whitmore, as does your brother's. I write to honor the debt between us and to warn you that our long silence is ending. What you choose to do with this warning is your decision, as it was your decision that December night to let me live. Your brother Heinrich died in a Soviet prison camp in 1946. I learned this through intelligence contacts after the war. I am sorry. I had hoped Stalin would honor his promise, but dictators are unreliable in all things, including mercy. You saved my life for nothing, though I have tried to make that life worthy of the sacrifice. Perhaps it brings you peace to know that Klaus Richter died in 1945, along with all the young men who believed war could be noble. Klaus Riedel has spent 5 decades teaching children to love literature and despise violence. I hope this counts as some form of redemption. The dagger and photograph are yours by right. Keep them or destroy them as you see fit. But know that in 6 months, perhaps less, the silence we have maintained will be broken by forces beyond our control. With respect and regret, K.R. Thomas's hands were shaking now, the letter fluttering like a trapped bird. 23 years of carefully constructed peace crumbling in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Grandfather? Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. Grandfather, you've gone completely white. What is it? Thomas looked up at his granddaughter, brilliant, determined, innocent of the cost of truth, and realized that Klaus Richter's warning had come too late. Emma was already digging into Blackwater House, already asking questions that would lead her to the same buried secrets that an Austrian historian was preparing to unearth. The equilibrium he had maintained for 2 decades shattered like glass. There would be no more quiet mornings in his garden. It's nothing, Emma. The words felt like ash in his mouth, just old pension paperwork. But Emma had inherited more than her grandmother's auburn hair. She had the instincts of a trained researcher, and those instincts were screaming. Her grandfather's face had transformed from ruddy health to pallor in the space of reading a single letter. His hands, usually steady from decades of gardening and groundskeeping, trembled as they hovered near the mysterious box. Grandfather, that's clearly not pension paperwork. Emma set down her phone and leaned forward. What's in the box? And don't tell me it's nothing you look like you've seen a ghost. Thomas stood abruptly, gathering the package against his chest like armor. Some things are better left alone, love. Trust an old man's wisdom. He walked toward the cottage with measured steps, fighting the urge to run. Behind him, he heard Emma's chair scrape against stone as she rose to follow. The back door of his cottage had never seemed so far away. Sanctuary had never felt so fragile. You're frightening me, Emma called after him. Whatever this is about, we can face it together. That's what families do. Thomas paused at his doorstep. Family. the word that had motivated every choice he'd made since that December night. He'd saved Klaus Richter to save Henry, lost Henry anyway, and built this quiet life to protect what remained of his family from the consequences of his wartime decisions. Now Emma's academic curiosity was pulling her toward the same dangerous truths that had cost his brother everything. Inside the cottage, Thomas locked the wooden box in his bedroom wardrobe behind winter coats and mothballed sweaters. The dagger's weight seemed to press through the wood, through the fabric, into his consciousness like a splinter working deeper into flesh. Klaus Richter's warning echoed in his mind. 6 months, perhaps less. The telephone sat on his kitchen counter like an accusation. Thomas stared at it, weighing options that all led to exposure. He could call his old contacts at MI6, the few who were still alive, still trusted with institutional memory. But official channels meant official questions. Investigations that would inevitably lead back to Emma's research, to Blackwater House, to classified files that were supposed to remain buried. Or he could do nothing. Let events unfold as Klaus Richter predicted. Let some Austrian historian publish documents that would unravel 23 years of carefully maintained silence. Let Emma discover the truth through newspaper headlines and government denials rather than through family confession. Both choices felt like betrayal. The cottage door opened behind him. Emma entered without knocking, a granddaughter's privilege that suddenly felt dangerous. "Grandfather, I've been thinking about the timing." Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone approaching a spooked horse. "This package arrives just as I'm researching family war records. That can't be coincidence." Thomas kept his back to her, staring out the kitchen window at his garden. The roses he'd tended for 2 decades seemed fragile now, vulnerable to frost and storm and the kind of revelation that withered everything it touched. "Perhaps you should focus your thesis elsewhere," he said quietly. "There are plenty of families with clearer histories, simpler stories. Grandfather." Emma's reflection appeared in the window beside his own. "Mrs. MacLeod told me something else yesterday. She said you moved here in 1948, right after the war ended. She said you seemed like a man running from something." The observation hit closer to truth than Thomas could bear. He had been running from debriefings that became interrogations, from colleagues who asked too many questions about the 12th German, from the weight of Henry's death and the knowledge that his choice had saved the wrong life. "Mrs. MacLeod talks too much," he said. "Maybe. Or maybe she's the only person willing to be honest about family secrets." Emma moved closer, her reflection growing clearer in the glass. "I found something else in the archives, Grandfather. A personnel file with sections redacted. Your file." Thomas's reflection went very still. "Emma, it says you were decorated for actions at an undisclosed location in December 1943, the same month Uncle Henry died, the same time frame as those troop movements to Blackwater House." Her voice gained strength as the pieces connected. "You were there, weren't you? Whatever happened to Uncle Henry, you were there when it happened." In the window's reflection, Thomas watched his granddaughter's face transform with the terrible clarity of discovery. The same expression Henry had worn when he'd volunteered for special operations, bright with purpose, innocent of consequences. Thomas closed his eyes and felt Klaus Richter's warning crystallize into certainty. The silence they had maintained was ending, not in 6 months, but now, in his own kitchen, through his own granddaughter's relentless pursuit of truth. There would be no more running from December 1943. Thomas opened his eyes and turned from the window, seeing Emma clearly for the first time since she'd arrived, not as his beloved granddaughter, but as the architect of his undoing. The irony carved through him like a blade. He'd spent 23 years protecting his family from the consequences of Blackwater House, only to watch his own blood dig toward the truth with academic precision. "Yes," he said, the word dropping into the kitchen silence like a stone into still water. "I was there." Emma's face shifted from triumph to something more complex, relief mixed with dread, the expression of someone who'd found what they were looking for and suddenly understood they weren't prepared for what came next. "What happened to Uncle Henry?" Her voice was smaller now, the confident researcher replaced by a granddaughter afraid of the answer. Thomas moved to his kitchen table, his legs suddenly unreliable. The confession that had lived in his throat for decades felt raw and enormous, too large for words, too terrible for this sunlit room where they'd shared so many peaceful mornings. Henry volunteered for an operation he didn't understand, Thomas began, his voice careful and distant. Churchill needed someone inside Soviet intelligence networks, a double agent. The plan was elegant. Henry would be captured during a staged operation, interrogated, turned, and sent to Moscow as a German asset, while secretly reporting to London. Emma sank into the chair across from him. A triple agent. Churchill promised he could bring Henry home after the war. Stalin promised safe passage in exchange for... Thomas stopped, the weight of state secrets pressing against his throat even now. In exchange for intelligence that saved Russian lives. But something went wrong. Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Everything went wrong. 12 German commandos infiltrated Blackwater House the night of Henry's final briefing. They'd learned about the meeting. Churchill, Stalin's representatives, British intelligence officials. It was supposed to be the most secure location in Scotland. He could see that December night as clearly as if it were playing on the kitchen window, snow falling through darkness, the sound of gunfire erupting from the manor's ground floor, the smell of cordite and blood and winter air. Most clearly of all, he remembered Klaus Richter's face, young, terrified, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, as he lay unconscious in Churchill's study. 11 Germans died that night, Thomas continued. The 12th, Klaus Richter, was captured alive. He carried documents about our arrangement with the Soviets, intelligence that would have exposed Henry's mission, gotten him killed in Moscow before he could accomplish anything. Emma's hands were pressed flat against the table, her knuckles white. What did you do? I made a choice. The words came out broken, each syllable weighted with 23 years of regret. I let Richter escape, staged it to look like incompetence rather than deliberation. I thought, if the Germans believed their mission had failed completely, they wouldn't investigate further. Henry's cover would hold. He'd be safe in Moscow. But he wasn't. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Stalin never intended to honor any agreement. Thomas felt the truth pour out of him like blood from a reopened wound. He used Henry for 2 years, fed him false intelligence to pass to London, then had him killed in a prison camp when he was no longer useful. The operation I tried to protect by letting Richter live had been compromised from the beginning. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock, each second marking the distance between past choices and present consequences. Thomas watched understanding dawn in Emma's eyes. Not just comprehension of events, but recognition of the weight her grandfather had carried alone for more than 2 decades. You've blamed yourself all these years, she said finally. I saved the wrong man. Thomas met her gaze directly, wanting her to understand the full scope of his failure. Klaus Richter lived to become a teacher in Austria. Henry died in a Soviet cell because I believed in promises from politicians, because I thought one act of mercy could balance decades of violence. Emma was quiet for a long time, processing not just the facts but their implications. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new gravity, the tone of someone who'd suddenly understood that academic research could have consequences in the real world. The package, she said, it was from him, from Richter. Thomas nodded. He's dying, cancer. His granddaughter found documents about Blackwater House in his papers. She wants to donate them to a museum. He paused, letting Emma work through the implications. Your research and hers are going to converge, love. 2 historians, 2 countries, both digging toward the same buried truth. Emma's face went pale as the full scope of the situation became clear. Her academic investigation wasn't just uncovering family history. It was about to expose classified wartime operations, international agreements, and intelligence methods that governments on both sides of the Atlantic had spent decades keeping secret. What happens now? She asked. Thomas looked at his granddaughter, brilliant, determined, and now complicit in secrets that had already cost one family member his life, and realized he was about to find out. I need to show you something else, he said, rising from the table with sudden purpose. Something I should have destroyed decades ago. He returned from the bedroom carrying not just Klaus Richter's box, but a larger case-battered leather with brass corners, the kind issued to military officers in 1943. Emma watched with the fascination of a researcher presented with primary sources, unaware that some documents were too dangerous to preserve. Thomas opened the case and withdrew a manila folder marked with faded official stamps. My debriefing reports from Blackwater House. I was supposed to surrender these after the operation was classified, but I kept copies. Insurance, I told myself. Evidence in case someone tried to rewrite what happened. Emma reached for the folder, but Thomas held it back. These files name every person present that night. British intelligence assets still alive today. Soviet agents who fed us information. Methods we used to infiltrate German networks. He paused, meeting her eyes. They also contain Churchill's personal notes about his arrangement with Stalin, handwritten agreements about post-war territorial concessions, promises that shaped the peace. Grandfather, these are historically invaluable. These are death warrants. Thomas's voice cut through her academic enthusiasm like a blade. Do you think Klaus Richter was the only one keeping secrets? Every government involved has spent 70 years burying this operation. The Americans don't know what Churchill promised Stalin. Parliament doesn't know how many British agents died protecting Soviet assets. The Russians don't know we had sources inside the Kremlin until 1953. Emma's excitement cooled into something more complex. You're saying publication would be dangerous. I'm saying publication would be impossible. Thomas opened the folder, revealing pages of typed reports interspersed with photographs. 6 hours after Klaus Richter's granddaughter contacts a museum, British intelligence will know. 12 hours later, they'll have seized every document and classified them under the Official Secrets Act. The historian will suffer an unfortunate accident, her research will disappear, and anyone who helped her will face prosecution for treason. The photographs showed Blackwater House as it had been in December 1943, a fortress of stone and shadows surrounded by unmarked snow. In one image, Thomas recognized himself, 20 years younger, standing beside a snow-covered military transport, his face grim with purpose he'd thought he understood. Emma studied the photograph with growing recognition. You look exactly like Father did in his army photos. The observation triggered a memory Thomas had tried to bury. Your father knew, Emma, not the details, but enough. When he was 15, he found these files hidden in the attic. Started asking questions about Uncle Henry, about why we moved to Scotland, about why I never talked about the war. What did you tell him? I told him the truth would destroy our family. Thomas felt the weight of that conversation pressing against his chest. I made him promise never to research Blackwater House, never to contact military archives, never to dig into records that could lead back to December 1943. He gave me his word. Emma's face went very still. Father died in that car accident when I was 12. Your father died driving back from London at 3 in the morning after meeting with a man who claimed to have information about Henry's death. Thomas watched his granddaughter's world reconstruct itself around a truth she'd never suspected. The meeting was a trap. Someone had learned he was asking questions about classified operations. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Emma's breathing, sharp and quick as the implications crystallized. Thomas saw the moment she understood. Her father's death hadn't been random tragedy, but the consequence of curiosity about family secrets. The same curiosity that now drove her own research. You think they killed him, she whispered. I think your father broke his promise to me, and promises about Blackwater House have consequences. Thomas closed the folder with finality. Just as Klaus Richter breaking his silence will have consequences, just as your research will have consequences if you continue. Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the window where her grandfather had stood minutes earlier. In the glass, Thomas could see her reflection, pale, shaken, but still determined, still his granddaughter. So we do nothing? She asked. We let Uncle Henry's death remain meaningless? We let Father's death remain unexplained? We protect the people who've been lying to our family for 70 years? Thomas joined her at the window, seeing not his beloved garden, but the long shadow of choices that had defined his life since 1943. We survive, Emma. That's what families do. We survive. That's not living, grandfather. Emma turned from the window, her voice carrying a new edge. That's just extended dying. In her words, Thomas heard an echo of Klaus Richter's letter, the clarity that came with accepting mortality. And for the first time in 23 years, he wondered if the secret he'd died protecting was worth the cost of staying alive. Behind him, Emma had returned to the table, studying the files with the methodical attention of someone building toward an irreversible decision. The sound of turning pages filled the silence like a countdown. "Grandfather," she said finally, her voice steady now, deliberate. "Klaus Richter survived for 70 years carrying this burden. Father died trying to understand it. You've sacrificed 2 decades of honest living to protect it." She looked up from the documents. "What if we're approaching this wrong? What if the secret isn't worth protecting anymore?" Thomas turned from the window. "You don't understand the forces involved. I understand that 3 generations of our family have been destroyed by this silence." Emma's voice gained strength as she spoke. "Uncle Henry died because Churchill and Stalin treated human lives like chess pieces. Father died because he asked questions about injustice. You've been dying slowly ever since, piece by piece, protecting people who never protected us." The truth of her words hit Thomas like physical force. How many mornings had he awakened feeling hollow, going through the motions of a life carefully constructed to avoid meaning? How many times had he caught himself staring at photographs of Henry, wondering if his brother's sacrifice had accomplished anything beyond feeding political ambitions? "Klaus Richter's letter," Emma continued, pulling the handwritten pages from the box. "He's not threatening us, Grandfather. He's warning us. Someone else is going to tell this story, whether we participate or not. The only choice we have is whether the truth comes from us or gets imposed on us." Thomas moved to the kitchen counter, his hands finding the familiar comfort of routine as he prepared fresh tea. But the simple actions felt different now, not comforting habits, but preparations for something that required clarity. If we cooperate with historians, if we provide documentation, there's no controlling where it leads. Intelligence services on 3 continents will mobilize to contain the damage. Then we don't cooperate with historians. Emma's voice carried a new certainty. We tell the story ourselves, on our terms, before anyone else has the chance to shape the narrative. The kettle's whistle pierced the evening quiet, and Thomas found himself thinking of another December evening, snow falling outside Blackwater House, as he'd made the choice that defined the rest of his life. He'd been younger then, believing he could control consequences through careful calculation. The years since had taught him that some choices created ripples beyond any single person's ability to manage. "Emma, you're talking about exposing state secrets, intelligence operations, political agreements that shape the modern world." He poured tea with practiced precision, buying time to think. The people responsible for protecting those secrets won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them. They've done it before. To protect what? Emma stood, moving to face him across the kitchen counter. Agreements made by dead politicians to serve dead empires. Operations that failed 70 years ago? How many more people have to die protecting mistakes? Thomas set down the teapot and really looked at his granddaughter, not the child he remembered, not the student she'd been, but the woman she'd become. In her face he saw Henry's determination, his father's stubbornness, and something new, the kind of courage that came from finally understanding the full cost of silence. "Your father asked me the same questions," Thomas said quietly. "I convinced him that the risk was too great, that some truths were too dangerous for our family to carry. 6 months later, he was dead. Because you made him carry the truth alone." Emma's words were gentle but implacable. "Because you forced him to choose between honoring his promise to you and his need to understand what happened to his family. That choice killed him, Grandfather. Not the secret itself, but the isolation of carrying it." The observation cut deeper than Thomas had expected. He'd spent decades blaming intelligence agencies, political calculations, and the weight of classified information. But Emma was right. His father had died alone with his questions because Thomas had refused to share the burden of answers. Outside the kitchen window, the last light was fading from his garden. The roses he'd tended with such careful devotion would face their first frost soon, entering dormancy that might or might not lead to spring renewal. Like secrets, he realized, some things buried too deeply never found their way back to light. Thomas reached across the counter and took his granddaughter's hand, a gesture of surrender that felt, surprisingly, like the first honest choice he'd made in 23 years. "If we do this," he said, "there's no safety net, no protection from consequences. We'll be completely exposed." Emma's grip tightened. "We already are, Grandfather. We just haven't admitted it yet." Emma's hand remained steady in his, but he could feel her pulse quicken. The simple declaration hung between them like a bridge they were about to cross together, knowing there would be no way back. "Not to historians or museums or government committees," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "We tell Klaus Richter's story, and Henry's story, and your father's story as one story. The real cost of Blackwater House." Emma nodded slowly. "How do we start?" Thomas released her hand and moved to the kitchen drawer, where he'd kept Klaus Richter's letter. But instead of the drawer, he found himself walking to the telephone, an old rotary model that seemed appropriate for connecting past and present. He dialed a number he'd memorized decades ago but never called. "Who are you calling?" Emma asked. "Someone who's been waiting for this conversation as long as I have." The phone rang twice before a cultured voice answered in German-accented English. "Klaus Richter. This is Thomas Whitmore." The name felt strange in his mouth after so many years of careful anonymity. "I received your letter." A long pause, filled with the weight of 70 years. When Klaus spoke again, his voice carried the same mixture of relief and resignation that Thomas felt. "I wondered if you would call. I hoped you would. My granddaughter found your package. She knows about Blackwater House, about Henry, about what happened that night." Thomas looked at Emma, who was listening with intense concentration. "We're ready to talk. My granddaughter Anna has been asking the same questions yours has. She's a historian working on a book about wartime resistance operations. She doesn't know yet that her grandfather was on the wrong side of history that night." Thomas understood the parallel immediately. Two old men, two curious granddaughters, two family secrets converging toward the same devastating truth. Perhaps it's time both girls learned that history is more complicated than their textbooks suggest. "Yes." Klaus's voice strengthened. "I'm dying, Thomas. Cancer. 6 months, perhaps less. Anna will find my papers after I'm gone, and she'll ask questions I won't be alive to answer. Better that she learns the truth from us while we can still provide context." Emma was making urgent gestures, and Thomas nodded. "Klaus, I want you to speak with Emma. She needs to hear this from someone who was there." He handed the phone to his granddaughter, watching her face transform as she connected directly with living history. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Two young women separated by nationality and generation, but united by the need to understand how their families had been shaped by events neither had witnessed. When Emma finally hung up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He remembers Uncle Henry. They spoke that night, before the attack. Henry told him about growing up in Scotland, about learning to fish in Highland streams. Klaus said Henry seemed like someone who should have been a teacher, not a spy." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Henry always wanted to teach. History of all things. He used to say the past was the only reliable guide to the future. The irony wasn't lost on him. His brother had died, serving a version of history written by politicians who cared nothing for truth. "Klaus is going to Vienna next week," Emma continued. "His granddaughter is presenting her research at a conference on wartime intelligence operations. He wants to tell her about Blackwater House before she discovers it herself. And he wants—" She paused, looking at Thomas directly. "He wants us to be there, to tell the complete story together." Thomas moved to the window again, but this time he wasn't seeking refuge in his garden's predictable rhythms. He was looking toward a future that suddenly seemed possible, dangerous, uncertain, but honest in a way his life hadn't been for decades. "Vienna," he said quietly. "Where it all began in a way, where intelligence operations and political agreements and family secrets converge into something that might actually resemble truth." Emma joined him at the window. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified." Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. "But not of dying anymore. I'm afraid of learning that the choice I made that night, letting Klaus live, protecting Henry's mission, might have been the only right thing I did in the entire war. And I'm afraid of discovering it wasn't." Outside, full darkness had settled over his garden. The roses were invisible now, but Thomas knew they were still there, preparing for winter, trusting in spring's eventual return. Some things, he realized, were worth the risk of believing in renewal. "We'll need to move carefully," he said. "Once we step forward publicly, there won't be any protection. British intelligence, Russian services, American agencies, they'll all mobilize to contain this story. Emma's reflection in the window showed determination that reminded Thomas powerfully of his brother. "Let them try, grandfather. Some truths are bigger than the people trying to hide them." Thomas nodded, feeling truly alive for the first time in 23 years. "Then we go to Vienna. And we tell the world what really happened at Blackwater House." But perhaps that was the point. Gardens survived their gardeners. Stories survived their original tellers. Truth had a persistence that individual lives couldn't match. The flight to Vienna passed in contemplative silence. Emma read Klaus Richter's letters again while Thomas stared at clouds that reminded him of the snow falling outside Blackwater House 70 years ago. He thought about Henry's last words to him. "Some prices are worth paying, Thomas. Just make sure you know what you're buying." At 23, Thomas had believed he understood. At 62, he realized understanding came only in retrospect, when choices had already extracted their full cost. Klaus was waiting at the hotel cafe, smaller than Thomas remembered, but with the same careful alertness that had kept him alive through 12 decades of war and peace. The recognition was instant, and strange two old men who had shared the most significant night of their lives but had spent 70 years as strangers to each other. "You look exactly as I expected," Klaus said, rising from his table. Older, wiser, but carrying the same weight. Their handshake lasted longer than politeness required. Thomas felt the tremor in Klaus's grip cancer's work and saw his own mortality reflected in the German's careful movements. Time was running short for both of them. Emma appeared from the hotel elevator with Anna Richter, Klaus's granddaughter, and Thomas watched two young women who had been strangers 12 hours earlier embrace like sisters united by shared purpose. They had spent the evening comparing family stories, filling gaps in each other's understanding, preparing for what was to come. The conference hall was smaller than Thomas had expected for what felt like such momentous disclosure. 40 historians and journalists, a handful of intelligence veterans, students taking notes for dissertations that might never be completed if certain agencies intervened. Anna Richter presented her grandfather's story, first the infiltration mission, the attack on Blackwater House, the choice Thomas had made to let one German survive. Then it was Thomas's turn. He spoke about Henry's recruitment, Churchill's secret negotiations with Stalin, the intelligence operation that had sacrificed British agents to protect Soviet assets. He described the night 12 men died and one lived, carrying a message that could have changed history's direction if anyone had been willing to listen. The questions came quickly, skeptically, professionally. Evidence, documentation, verification. Emma and Anna had spent days preparing responses, cross-referencing family papers with historical records, building a case that would survive academic scrutiny. But Thomas found himself answering differently than he'd planned. "You want proof that governments sacrifice individuals for political convenience?" he asked the room. "That intelligence operations create more secrets than they solve? That wartime alliances exact prices paid by people who never consented to the bargain?" He gestured toward Klaus, toward Anna, toward Emma. "Look around this room. 3 generations, 2 countries, 70 years of consequences. We are the proof." The aftermath unfolded exactly as Thomas had predicted. Government representatives appeared within hours, asking careful questions about national security and classified information. Journalists made phone calls that went unanswered. Historians discovered that certain archives had become suddenly inaccessible for routine maintenance, but the story was already moving beyond their control. Anna had published preliminary research online before the conference. Emma had contacted colleagues in universities across Europe. Klaus had written detailed memoirs that would be released regardless of what happened to their authors. The truth had too many threads for any single agency to cut them all. 3 days later, Thomas stood on his hotel balcony overlooking the Danube, watching morning light reflect off water that had flowed past this city through empires and wars and revolutions. Emma joined him with coffee and newspapers headlines that would have terrified him a week earlier but now seemed like evidence that secrets, finally exposed, lost their power to destroy. "Do you regret it?" Emma asked. Thomas considered the question seriously. British intelligence would certainly make their lives difficult. Russian services might take more direct action. American agencies would work to discredit anything that complicated their own historical narratives. But for the first time in 23 years, Thomas felt clean. I regret that Henry didn't live to see this, he said. I regret that your father died carrying questions instead of answers. I regret the years I spent protecting people who never protected us. He sipped his coffee, tasting possibility. But I don't regret the truth. Below them, Vienna was waking to another day in its long history. The city had survived secrets before imperial conspiracies, wartime betrayals, intelligence operations that had seemed crucial at the time but now rated footnotes in historical studies. Truth had persistence that outlasted the institutions trying to contain it. Thomas thought about his roses, dormant now but preparing for spring. Some things were worth the risk of believing in renewal.